Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, thanks for joining me again.
Hey, Sharif, great to be back.
Great. Well, I wanted to discuss a book with you today, Kevin. It's called Atomic Habits, and I know you're pretty familiar with these ideas, and it's something that I've actually referenced in recent podcasts, as one astute listener observed. But I thought today we could do a kind of deep dive into the ideas here. So starting with just basically presenting the ideas and then comparing them to our approach, because there's definitely a lot of overlap in what he's talking about. So I just wanted to get clear of the differences in the kind of advice that we give, and then if there's anything we can learn from his approach, but then how our approach, differs, and what might be
Exactly.
missing in his approach. So,
Great. Let's
great.
dive
Well,
in.
yeah,
There's
let's
a lot of
dive
good
in.
in the book. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we start with, it's all about habits. So it's called Atomic Habits, and he sees as central to having a happy life having good habits. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think that probably there's a lot of variation what it means to have a habit and for it to be good. So, I think, being good at flossing is probably not the same as being good at being generous. So there's a wide swath of things you can call habits. But in general, the idea that there's a lot of power in habits, hence like the atomic, they're small and they're somehow discrete, but there's also a lot of power contained in them, I think is a powerful insight.
And he has this. I liked his discussion at the beginning that when you start improving the habits, and he talks about things like exercise or eating healthy or morning meditation or waking up early, these kinds of habits that sometimes you don't initially see the benefits, but then cumulatively over time, they have a kind of compounding effect. So if you just change one thing, maybe you can get discouraged if you don't make the progress you think you should be making. But if you change 5 or 6 of these things, then those all work together and you start seeing a lot more progress.
Yeah, he talks about is it the valley of despair or the valley of
The value,
discouragement?
yeah.
Yeah. Where that you would think that if you're practicing a habit regularly, that it's gonna get easier and easier every single time. And at first, it seems like it's not changing much at all. So, but if you stick with it, there's an inflection point, and then the habit starts kicking in more and more, and it gets easier and easier, way easier than you thought it could have. And so I think that that's a great insight and can give because I think a lot of people give up on trying to change behaviors early because they feel like it's not coming easy enough. So it's just not me. I'm just not a morning person. I can't tell you how many people have written to us in some way or another and said, that they were so liberated by this idea that there's no such thing as a morning person. That well, to the extent that anyone can become a morning person if they approach it the right way. And if you have good morning routines, those actually do you get the same pickup. But they never got through that valley of discouragement in the beginning. They thought it would get easier and easier every single day, and it didn't. But then, whoa, suddenly it kicks in. And now they find it actually that they have a lot of energy and they're enthused in the morning. So I think that's a great, great lesson to give people.
Now for him, so he's looking first at just one habit, and seeing, yeah, there's a kind of improvement. There's a improvement that happens here, but then also looking at if you take all the habits you're working on as a whole, and this is where you get atomic habits, is that each habit is like an atom. It's small on its own, but it's part of a larger whole. And when you take it as part of a larger whole, it's kind of stronger and more powerful, so that good habits reinforce one another. And that's where I think he's saying you really get this kind of exponential growth as you're developing the habits. So in our case, what we've noticed is that there are actually two habits that have a really good synergy, which is waking up in the morning and then doing a golden hour.
Yeah.
So those two
So,
habits really work well together, and you see a lot of growth just from those
and
two.
I would say the whole inventory, on
Mhm.
OptimalWork, we have this inventory. And those are essentially 24 habits, maybe 25 if we put the diet one in
That
there.
one, yeah.
So yeah, I what is it? I eat nourishing foods or
I
something. I eat foods that
deliberately
nourish me.
choose, yeah, yeah,
There you go. Foods that are nourishing,
yeah.
exactly. So that would be 25. But we have 24 habits that all support each other and grow together. And I see these as being the bigger, more important architectonic habits in people's lives that actually structure lives, I should say. So, and they do get easier once you start, once people in the inventory get a score above a certain level, they tend to stay above that level because the habits all stick together and hold together. And so I think that, yeah, in general, that's true.
And then the maybe second idea to cover before actually getting into his theory of habits is his notion of habits. There being three layers of behavior change. So you have identity, processes, and outcomes. So at the core level, you have your identity, your kind of beliefs about yourself or what your values are. We don't use the term values, we talk about ideals because they're objective. You don't just get to choose what's good. But and then you have processes, which is like the habits, your kind of daily schedule, your systems, whatever. And then you have outcomes, which is the result. And he says too often people focus specifically on outcomes, like I want to write a book or I want to get into the school. It's better if you can focus on the habits, like I'm going to write for 30 minutes every single day, or I'm going to put in an hour on my college applications every or whatever. But he actually recommends starting first with values and beliefs. And I think he's a little bit unclear in some place about what he means by this. But I think one thing he's getting at is growth mindset and ideals, like having a sense of what ideals are and what you want to guide your life with. So that's pretty important for us too, I think.
Well, there's a problem I think with coming up with these thinking of, and this is a slightly complex theory that he presents. Usually we talk about outcomes and processes. So you have, you can be focused on, getting the ball in the basket, or you can be focused on the right form of how to throw the basketball. So, and those are usually two things. And he's adding in a third here, your identification of yourself as a basketball player. So, like, I am a basketball player. And he says that really you want to start thinking about that as a kind of habit. The way that you think of yourself as a habit. I think that's where he's on his shakiest grounds. So I know you wanted to delay any critique until we gave him full credit. But I think this one is like just identifying yourself as a basketball player. Well, maybe it makes you more likely to engage the process of practicing and getting the form right, but it doesn't produce that process directly. There's a choice that you make. And that choice doesn't necessarily depend on some label that you have given some kind of credence to in your head. I think you can't reduce choices to something like that of just saying words in your head. I am a basketball player, and now that's just going to produce my practicing. Does that
Yeah.
sound fair?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah,
And
it's a little bit like we talk about positive self-talk as to distinguish
yeah,
it from reframing. It's a little bit like that,
yeah,
or maybe a
and so
lot.
at least I think that there is a good application of it, which is that it's true. The more you see a vision of yourself in a certain way, that image is what we think of as the basis of reframing. Is this image of you possessing a desirable quality, that motivates you to want to be like that. And so that's the image of the koan that Aristotle talks about. That's how you shape a future action. Is before you do it, you think, okay, what is the image of what I want this to look like? So with that tweak, if you call that the identity, and then you say, and then that helps you to shape the process, and that will give you the best outcome, then you have a tight theory. But it could be misused if people just were to read some of the things about these identity statements. Because, like, if a person says, I am just really generous, Well, that might not make him a generous person. In fact, it might make him less generous because he'll be less apt to try practicing it because he thinks he already possesses that virtue of generosity. So a lot of times people think that they're really like kind, and easygoing, and in fact, they're somewhat tyrannical in certain areas, and they can be really unkind, and they just don't see it because they believe this about themselves. So that's why I think that's the tricky thing. But if those people were to really form an image in their mind before doing something about being kind or affable or easygoing would look like, and then make sure they're using that to shape their next behavior, it would help. So the identity needs to be your understanding of how you most want to be, rather than a label of how you are. That's the big distinction.
Yeah. Now, when you're working with patients or working with people, do you do a lot of this kind of identity work before getting into behavioral change? I recall, and actually, we incorporated this into the True Success tool on OptimalWork.com. Is that sometimes people think that they have to no longer be an anxious person before they can be loving. It's like, okay, first I have to get over my anxiety, and then I can give my attention to the people closest to me. And one of the flips you try to get help people to see is that no, actually you can have the anxiety or the nervousness and still be loving, or you can have the feeling of impatience and still be patient. So actually there's a kind of an interplay between behavior, feeling, and identity. It's very subtle but powerful.
Yeah, and that's what frees people. When people really see that, wait a second, that what matters most for me in life is to be loving and generous and caring and attentive and all these beautiful qualities, the forms the koan can take. Well, then they see that I could still have my anxiety and be practicing those things. That and then they realize that the key thing here is not the presence or absence of anxiety. It's what am I actually choosing to focus on and do in the moment? And if I do the loving thing and the kind thing, that will actually start to shape me. And I don't have to wait for my anxiety to go away or for the craving to go away. So, and I think that the problem with most um, theories of habit formation that come from animal models is that they put everything on the craving or the fear, as if that is the central thing to habit change. And then the idea would be like, oh, like somehow I have to like outsmart my craving or get around my craving. I'll out strategize it. And then the craving will never even get triggered. And then I'll be free to change my habits because I won't have this craving standing in the way anymore, or I won't have my fear standing in the way anymore. And when it comes to habit formation, it all comes down to cravings and fear if you're talking about animals.
So I think that's a great transition to get into the meat of his approach to habits. So I think, yeah, maybe I can just briefly summarize it. Actually, stepping back a little bit, I think it's very compelling to readers because it's a kind of elegant theory that's grounded in science and has clear applications to tell you what to do. Um, so in one sense, it's very kind of impressive as like a self help or personal growth book in the
Yeah.
way in its elegance. So
And it's
his
probably helped an enormous number of people.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, and so because if for the right person in the right time, it might just be exactly the thing they needed to
Hmm.
really get them to make progress.
Hmm. So yeah, so his approach. So he says habits form according to a four-step process. So first you have a cue that kind of gets you thinking about it, and then you have a craving internally that causes you to want to do the thing. And then you have your actual response, your action, and then you have a reward that then reinforces the formation habit, the forming of the habit. So these are the four steps: cue, craving, response, reward. And then his advice for how to then shape good habits is basically do one thing for each of those steps. So in for the cue, make the habit obvious. So for example, if you want to develop a habit of reading, then leave the book you want to read out on your living room table to make it super obvious. So cue, that's cue. Then craving. law is this the first law, make it obvious. The second law is make it attractive. And then for response, the third law is make it easy. And then for reward, the fourth law is make it satisfying. And then he has opposite. If you want to break a bad habit, there's inversions for each of those laws. So make it invisible, make it unattractive, make it difficult, make it unsatisfying. So it's kind of interesting. It's actually in some ways in one kind of way like similar to our approach where with reframing mindfulness challenge, we said, hey, there are these three steps for the amygdala for anxiety, right? Detect the threat, sound the alarm, watch the response. And so to shape each of those steps is reframing mindfulness challenge. So there's kind of at some level, like a structural level, a similarity of how he's going about deriving his theory, I think.
Exactly. And insofar as there's similarities, it's because we're trying to derive them from actually in some ways from the brain and animal models and how things work. So I think yeah, no, I think you gave a great summary there of of his idea. And if you apply it to an animal, you could see that well, you know, if you want to change a dog's behavior, let's say the dog keeps, jumping up on the couch and eating the potato chips. Well, it's okay. Is the the cue is that it sees the potato chips on the couch, and then, and that triggers a craving in the dog, and so the dog then does the behavior jumping on the couch, and then the reward is it eats the potato chips. And so you could say that that's how the dog gets the habit of doing this. Is that it did it once and it was rewarding, and then keeps doing it. And if you want to break that habit, then you have to undo each of those steps. And so, insofar as it goes, within certain limits, it has the benefit of seeming complete. But I would say it's not complete. So, and that, but I think that people can get attracted to its seeming completeness. So, until it's like a model that fits tightly together, and they're like, well, wait a second, what habits does this actually apply to in humans? Like, I understand it applies to dogs, and okay, humans, it applies to drug use, and perhaps, and but does it really apply? Is it actually? I think the more you apply it to human behavior, the less wise it gets.
Hmm.
You remember what's the reward for reading
Uh, that
that he
he
suggests?
suggests, yeah. I think I may have given this as an example, like to have ice cream after while you're reading or
Yeah,
after you're
exactly.
reading or something like that.
Yeah, so that's the problem is if you think of cravings as being the ultimate driver of human behavior and somehow being the necessary engine of human behavior, the way they are for animals, then you're going to say, oh, you would. So really, what he's doing is substituting another craving. That you have to crave the reward more than you crave this other thing. So, and that all you have are cravings, and it's because cravings are always for tangible physical things. You don't have cravings for spiritual things. And by spiritual, I mean anything that is not tangible. So you never have a craving to be generous or a craving to be kind. Uh, Maybe in some ways you crave a bond with someone, but you don't crave being loving with that person in the same way, especially not being what you call charitable. Being kind of selfless and self-forgetting and self-giving, that you don't crave. And so all the real human goods, which come from human ideals and human bonds, you don't have cravings driving the formation. And those are all habits. And in fact, those are the only meaningful habits that we have, are the ones that create a human kind of fulfillment and thriving. So because he's dealing with cravings as the ultimate basis for his whole model, because the cue triggers the craving, the response is to fulfill the, just to somehow satisfy the craving, and the reward is the satisfaction of the craving. Because of that model, he's chained to cravings. It's like he's put everything into cravings being the driver rather than, and so that means he's chained to satisfaction. And he's chained then to a completely left brain approach to motivation. because the only thing the left brain understands in motivation is satisfaction. And I think the right brain understands fulfillment and completeness of life and what it means to be meaningful. And those things don't operate in the same way. So insofar as humans are shapeable by these laws, it's particularly insofar as they're in a left brain kind of structure that they have. And so the left brain then, when it tries to change behavior, will only try to do strategizing because it doesn't actually have reframing. That's a right brain thing. It doesn't have mindfulness, which is a right brain thing, or the stretch challenge, which again is a right brain thing. And so what you see in his model is actually a very interesting way in which you have a completely left brain account of of behavior change.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that is very absent, for example, is any discussion of, hey, what habits should you do? So it's
Exactly.
like because it's he presents it as though ki- I don't know, either it's obvious, like you're just supposed to know what habits you're supposed to do, which is true at some level. I think that people who habitually sleep in probably know at some level. They're like, well, yeah, I probably should wake up when my alarm sounds. But there's no deeper account, and this gets to the idea that the habits that he's treating are tend to be superficial habits, almost as you kind of described them, animal behaviors. But there's no account of which habits are good. Is there a hierarchy of habits, and how do we actually progress and grow in deeper
And what
ways?
you find in all these types of writings, and this might be one of the most helpful and best examples of this genre, of helping people think. Uh, I think it's better than, I mean, there are some models out there of discussing how to grow in willpower where it comes down to eating more sugar, which has to be the worst idea ever. Because of some supposed interpretation of Israeli judges who needed sugar in order to have better verdicts. And it's like, that to me was that's the epitome of bad advice. You don't grow in willpower by having glucose. Uh, but what happens in these kind of books is that whenever they leave some kind of thing as obvious, like, well, how do you know which habit? Well, it's just obvious. It means that they're sneaking it in because it's actually not part of their model, and so they will have recourse to it just seeming obvious. Well, of course, love matters. Of course, relationships matter. Well, how does your theory give rise to that? Aren't the bonds we have with others habits? But there's no sense of that, right, in the book. Because it's like, because this is based on cravings, there is no concept of love, and there's no real concept of bonds and what higher order habits look like. So at the most, you have skills, and that's about as far as the left brain can get in strategizing. It can think of skills to strategize. But what the reframing adds beyond just skills is the image of the good, which is the ideals of how you want what kind of person do you want to grow into? And then even more than ideals are bonds. Because the highest ideals, as you start getting into being understanding and being forgiving, well, all of that are just ways more and more purely of being loving, which is about bonds and directing it to bonds. And so those are completely right brained, and those are not about satisfaction at all, but they are about fulfillment or some kind of deeper sense of growth. And then reframing is what gives you the next step, which is mindfulness. That as you're seeing these things that you want to grow in that are real, because ideals are real and bonds are real, you open up to the whole of reality to say bring that you can accept it. And that means what you're feeling in the moment, the emotions that you have. Interesting that there's no role for mindfulness in his. That would have been an easy habit to incorporate,
Yeah, he
but
talks
there's no.
about the habit of it's good to meditate in the morning, but then
Yeah,
it's
because
just
that's
treated as
obvious.
another habit. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
it's obviously good to meditate, so
yeah,
you'll sneak it in.
yeah,
But I think that's much more crucial to behavior change in general,
mm,
right? That you learn to be mindfully aware before you automatically act. You be mindfully aware of what you're feeling if it's being driven by a feeling. But not all automated actions are driven by feelings. Sometimes it's just overlearned behaviors. Yeah, and so that I floss after brushing my teeth isn't, it's like that's just the pattern I've always done. It's like when I put my shoes away, I tend to put the right ones higher and the left ones lower into a little shoe caddy. So, it's just okay, but that is not like a meaningful habit. But it definitely is a consistent behavior that I do. It is a habit, but there's no craving. Um, so yeah, I think that mindfulness is like an extension of a reframe. Like to reframe, only humans reframe. Animals can't reframe. To be mindful, only humans are mindful, right? Animals can't be. And then to have the stretch challenge is actually mindfulness of the whatever the stretch is. It could be a craving, but it could also just be a stretch of effort. Uh, that then gets continued through time. And so it's like you stay mindful and you keep it up and you try to keep it higher and higher. So as you do the task. But that kind of quality challenge is also a completely human thing. So I think that what's distinctly human, which is reframing mindfulness and quality challenge, is specifically left out of the model. And so what you're left with is a way of accomplishing, if you have already a reason why the reframe, and the presence of mind and attentiveness, and can embrace the challenge, then you can use these as ways of strategizing. And so I think this is what the strength of the book is. The book gives us strategies for building for actually changing particular habits, but can't guide you as to which habits to try building and or why.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great way of kind of getting to the core of things. So, and we're kind of basically at the end of our time. So, I don't know if there's any other points that you want to discuss or any final points you want to leave us with.
No, I think what's just the best part of the book to end on a good note is that what he does have, which is right brained, is the idea of a growth mindset. So, and that people can change and we can improve our lives. And so, even though I would say he goes about it in a kind of left brain way and leaves out the distinctly human, it still is a powerful message of the possibilities that lie within human nature and for us to be able to change ourselves. And I think that is an encouragement that everyone should take to heart.
Nice. Awesome. Well, hey Kevin, thanks so much for
Thank you,
joining us
Sharif.
and shedding light on
Yeah.
this very influential book.
No, and thanks so much for your work of really helping me to understand it and summarize it. So
Of
thank you.
course. Okay, great. Well, we'll be back next week.